She stepped off the stagecoach, and her first breath nearly brought her to her knees. Not from the cold Montana air. From the 3 broken ribs she had been hiding for 11 weeks. Evelyn Carter pressed her hand against her coat, steadied herself against the doorframe, and forced her face into something that resembled calm. She had survived worse than this. She had survived much worse. But the man standing in the dirt road ahead, the stranger she had agreed to marry, was already watching her. And the last thing she could afford was for anyone to see that she was barely holding herself together. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment below, telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Montana Territory, autumn 1881. Silver Creek was the kind of town that asked no questions. That was exactly why Evelyn had chosen it. She had spent 3 weeks studying the Matrimonial Gazette, reading every advertisement from men out west who needed wives. Farmers, merchants, blacksmiths. Most of them wrote in short, practical sentences about land acreage and livestock counts as if a wife were another item on the ranch supply list. Caleb Whitaker's advertisement had been different. It was only 4 sentences long. Rancher 36. Widower, Silver Creek, Montana. Own land, small herd, quiet life. Looking for a woman who wants a fresh start. No questions about the past. Just a chance to begin again. She had read those 4 sentences 14 times before she picked up her pen. No questions about the past. She had never written a letter faster in her life. That had been 3 months ago. 3 months in which her life had collapsed, rebuilt itself in a single desperate act of will, and then collapsed again in ways she still could not fully bring herself to think about. But she was here now. That was what mattered. She was here. Ashya. The stagecoach had pulled into Silver Creek at just past 9 in the morning, and the town was already moving around her in that particular way. Frontier towns moved loud without being welcoming, busy without being warm. Evelyn stood on the wooden platform beside her single suitcase and waited. She had learned to wait without looking like she was waiting. It was a skill she had developed over years of needing to appear composed when she was anything but. She held her shoulders back. She breathed through her mouth in small, careful intervals, shallow enough to keep the pain manageable, deep enough to keep from passing out. 11 weeks. That was how long she had been breathing like this. 11 weeks since the night that had broken 3 of her ribs and ended 1 chapter of her life so violently that she had not stopped to grieve it. There had been no time. She had packed 1 suitcase while blood was still drying on her lip. She had made her decision in a single hour of terrible clarity. She would go west. She would start again. She would never tell anyone. "Peg, Miss Carter." The voice came from her left. She turned. He was taller than she expected. Not in a showy way, just genuinely tall, with the lean build of a man who worked hard every day of his life and didn't think about it. He wore a plain coat and a dark hat that he was already removing as he approached her, and his face was, she searched for the word, careful. That was the only way she could describe it. Not handsome in any conventional sense, though he wasn't unpleasant to look at. His face was a working face, a face that had seen weather and loss, and the kind of long silences that come from living alone. He had dark eyes. She had not expected dark eyes. She had imagined something lighter, something easier to read. "Yes," she said. "I'm Evelyn Carter." He stopped in front of her, and for a moment he simply looked at her. Not in the way men had sometimes looked at her, measuring and calculating, just looked. The way you might look at a sky you weren't sure about, trying to understand what was coming. "Caleb Whitaker," he said, and extended his hand. She took it and shook it the way she had practiced, firm, confident, nothing fragile. "I'm glad you made it," he said. There was something in the way he said it that struck her. Not, "You look better than your photograph," which she had heard before, and which always felt like the opening move in some game she didn't want to play. Not, "You must be tired," which was what people said when they wanted to acknowledge your suffering without actually having to engage with it. Just, "I'm glad you made it." Like the important thing was simply that she had arrived. He looked at her face, then briefly without drama, and she saw his eyes register something. She had no idea what he saw. She had become expert at controlling her expression, but she also knew that 11 weeks of hidden pain leaves marks that no amount of composure can fully erase. He said nothing about what he saw. Instead, he said, "Did you eat today?" Evelyn blinked. It was such a small question. It was such an ordinary human, completely unexpected question. Yes, she said. "At the last stop." "That was 4 hours ago." "I'm fine." He nodded. He did not argue. He did not push. He simply picked up her suitcase smoothly, without making a performance of it, without waiting to be asked, and said, "The wagon's this way." And Evelyn stood there for half a second, thrown completely off balance by a man who had just done 3 small things she hadn't been prepared for. He had looked at her without wanting something. He had asked if she was hungry, and he had carried her bag without making her feel weak. She followed him to the wagon. The drive out to the ranch was the longest silence Evelyn had sat through in years. But it was a different kind of silence than she was used to. She was used to silences that had edges. Silences that meant, "I am angry with you," or "I am deciding what to do with you," or "You had better not say the wrong thing." Silences that required her to remain alert and careful and always slightly braced for what came next. This silence had no edges. Caleb drove without speaking, and it was not because he was angry or calculating or waiting for her to make a mistake. It was simply because he was a man who didn't fill space with words when he didn't have words to put in it. She found this disturbing in a way she couldn't immediately explain. When the wagon wheels hit a rough patch of trail, he guided the horses smoothly to a slightly different line without comment, and she realized he had been watching the road for her benefit, finding the path of least resistance. She told herself it was coincidence. A few minutes later, when the wind picked up and turned cold from the north, he reached behind the seat and placed a folded wool blanket on the bench beside her. Not on her. Beside her. Available if she wanted it. Not imposed. She put it over her legs. "Thank you," she said. He said. And that was the end of that. Evelyn's plan developed over weeks on a train, and then a stagecoach had been simple and practical. She would be a good wife. She would be useful. She would cook clean, manage the household work, whatever work was needed. She would be no trouble. She would ask nothing and expect nothing, and in exchange, she would have a safe place, a roof, a life that was hers in some small basic sense. A future that did not involve the family of her dead first husband, discovering where she had gone. She had not planned to feel anything. She had put that possibility away in a box somewhere inside her chest and locked it very firmly, because feeling things meant trusting people, and she had spent years learning that trusting people was the thing that got you hurt. She had not planned for any of this to be complicated, so she was not prepared for what happened when they arrived at the ranch. She had expected a bachelor's house. She had imagined without quite realizing she was imagining it something neglected, dirty dishes, unwashed windows. The particular kind of disorder that accumulates when a man lives alone for years and tells himself he'll deal with it later. Instead, she found a kitchen that had been recently cleaned. Not perfectly, this was clearly a working man's home, and there were honest traces of hard use on every surface, but cleaned. Deliberately. Someone had made an effort. There were 2 hooks beside the door for coats. There was a wood stove that had been recently blackened. There was a small table with 2 chairs and a plate of biscuits covered with a cloth still faintly warm. She looked at all of it. Then she walked to the door at the back of the kitchen, which was slightly ajar, and pushed it open. A bedroom. Small. Simple. A quilt on the bed that looked hand-stitched. A window with a curtain that was not entirely even, but was clearly new. A small dresser with an empty top, as if it had been cleared for her. And on the interior side of the door, a lock. A brand new latch lock, the iron still bright, installed with obvious care. She stood there and stared at it. Caleb appeared in the doorway behind her. "You put a lock on this door," she said. "Yes," she turned. "Before I arrived." "Yes." She studied him. "Why?" He seemed to think the question was strange, as if the answer was obvious. "Because everyone deserves a room where they feel safe," he said. And then he was gone back to the kitchen, and she could hear him putting a kettle on, moving around with quiet efficiency. And Evelyn stood in the small bedroom with the new curtains and the cleared dresser and the bright new lock on the door. And she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and held very still until she was certain she was not going to cry. She was not going to cry. She had decided this years ago. Crying was something she had given up because it had never helped anything, and it had sometimes made things worse. Crying showed weakness, and weakness invited consequences she could not afford. She was not going to cry in a stranger's house on the first day she had arrived. She was not going to let a lock on a door undo years of careful armor. She took 3 shallow breaths, careful measured, and walked back into the kitchen. "I can make supper," she said, "if you show me where things are." Caleb was standing at the stove with his back to her. "Beans are in the cupboard on the left," he said. "Salt pork hanging by the window. There's cornmeal if you want it." "I want it." "All right." He moved out of her way without being asked. She cooked supper, and neither of them talked much, and the food was plain and good, and she ate more than she had eaten in weeks. Because without realizing it, for the first time in a very long time, she sat down to a meal without the particular tight anxiety of waiting for something to go wrong. She noticed that after supper, he washed his own plate. She didn't know what to do with that. Done. The first week passed. She established routines quickly because routines were the framework she used to manage herself. She was up before him. She had breakfast on the table by the time he came in from the morning chores. She organized the pantry, mended 2 items of his clothing without mentioning it, and started a kitchen garden from seeds she found in an old tin near the back door. He never commented on any of it. Not in a dismissive way, she watched him closely enough to understand the difference. He simply acknowledged it the way you acknowledge weather, as a real thing that exists in your life. A slight nod when he saw the mended shirt. A pause when he noticed the organized shelves. Once he said, "You didn't have to do all that." She said, "I wanted to." He said, "All right," and that was the end of it. What he did do was notice. She began to understand this about him in layers. He was not a man who expressed things verbally, but he was paying attention with a depth and consistency that she had rarely encountered. When she favored her left side while hanging laundry, he quietly rearranged the drying line lower without explanation. When she mentioned once in passing that she had a headache, there was a cup of willow bark tea on the table when she came back from the garden 30 minutes later. When she stayed up late reading by lamplight and fell asleep in the chair, she woke to find a blanket placed over her gently so as not to disturb her and the lamp turned down. He never asked about any of it. He never made her feel observed or catalogued. He was simply present. And that was the most quietly terrifying thing Evelyn Carter had encountered in years. 3 weeks in, she made a mistake, a small one, but he saw it. She was carrying a basket of wet laundry out to the line, and a corner of the basket caught on the doorframe, and she jerked it free without thinking. And the sudden twist sent a bolt of pain through her left side so sharp and white that she stopped breathing entirely for a full second. She recovered immediately, reset her expression, continued walking. But when she glanced up, Caleb was 20 feet away at the fence line, and he was watching her. He hadn't missed it. She held his gaze for a moment. He looked away first and went back to his work. He said nothing. And she told herself that was fine. She told herself she had gotten away with it. She told herself she had hidden it again. She was wrong. Doug. That evening after supper, Caleb sat down across from her at the kitchen table. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at her with that careful, unhurried look of his. "I'm not going to pry," he said. That's not who I am." She waited. "But I need you to know something." She made herself hold his gaze. "This is your home now," he said. "Whatever that means, whatever that takes. I'm not looking for a woman to be perfect. I'm not looking for someone who has no problems." He paused. "I already know you're carrying something. I don't need to know what it is. But I want you to know that if you ever decide you want to put it down, even just some of it, you're allowed to do that here." Evelyn stared at him. She had prepared herself for questions. She had been building answers to questions for 11 weeks. She had answers for, "What happened to you, and why didn't you tell me? And what did you think you were doing coming here in that condition?" She did not have an answer for, "You are allowed to put it down." "I'm fine," she said, because it was the only thing she knew how to say. "All right," he said. He got up and put another piece of wood on the fire and said goodnight and went to his room. And Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap and her ribs aching, and something behind her sternum aching worse. And she sat there for a long time in the warm kitchen while the fire burned down, and she thought about what it meant that a man she had known for 3 weeks had just offered her more grace than she had been given in years. She thought about the lock on her bedroom door. She thought about the tea that appeared when she had headaches. She thought about the blanket placed over her while she slept. And she thought, "Be careful, Evelyn. This is the most dangerous thing that has happened to you in a very long time. Because this man might actually be kind, and if you believe in that kindness, and it turns out to be something else, you will not survive it." 4 weeks, 5. The rhythm of the ranch became her rhythm. The mornings were hers, cooking, gardening, the particular piece of work that was straightforward and produced visible results. The afternoons, she sometimes helped with smaller tasks around the property, mending fences, organizing the barn inventory of supplies before winter. Caleb never treated her like she was fragile. He also never treated her like she was a ranch hand. He treated her like a person who had skills and judgment and the right to make her own decisions, and he consulted her about things she hadn't expected to be consulted about. "Winter's going to be hard this year," he said one evening. "I need to decide whether to sell 3 of the older cattle now for cash or try to carry them through. What do you think?" She blinked at him. "Why are you asking me?" He looked mildly puzzled. "Because you're here. Because you're smart. Because you might see something I don't." She had not had a conversation like this in years. She sat down and thought about it seriously and asked 2 questions about cash reserves and feed stores. And then she said, "Sell 1, not 3. Keep enough capital for an emergency and enough cattle for spring." He looked at her for a moment. "That's what I was thinking," he said. "Then why did you ask me?" "Because I wanted to know if I was right." She didn't know what to say to that. She was beginning to realize that not knowing what to say to Caleb Whitaker was going to become a recurring feature of her life in Silver Creek. The trouble started in the 6th week. It didn't come from Caleb. It came from town. She had ridden in with him for supplies the first time she had been back in Silver Creek since she arrived, and she had felt the town look at her differently than it had before. Not hostilely, but with that particular frontier curiosity that she recognized as the precursor to questions she couldn't answer safely. Martha Hale, who ran the dry goods store, had been warm enough on the surface and sharp as a tack underneath. "You're settling in all right then, Mrs. Whitaker?" she said with a smile that had too many teeth in it. Evelyn hadn't corrected the Mrs. Whitaker. They weren't married yet, but she was not going to explain that to Martha Hale. "Very well, thank you," she said. "You're from back east." Someone mentioned Philadelphia. "Baltimore," she said, which was technically true in that she had passed through Baltimore once. "Long way to come," Martha said. "It is. You must have left something important behind." Evelyn met her eyes. "I left something behind," she said quietly. "Important isn't the word I'd use." And she moved to the next shelf and picked up a tin of baking powder and said nothing else. On the drive home, Caleb glanced at her. "Martha's mostly harmless," he said. "I know the type," Evelyn said. "She gossips, but she's not malicious." "I know the type," Evelyn said again. A pause. "She's not the one you need to worry about," Caleb said. Evelyn turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Richard Holloway," he said. "He owns the bank and half the property north of town. He's been trying to get hold of my land for 2 years. He's the kind of man who looks for leverage." "And you're telling me this why?" Caleb was quiet for the moment. "Because I want you to know the landscape," he said. "Before you navigate it alone." Evelyn sat with that for the rest of the drive. A man who told her about the dangers before she walked into them. A man who treated her like she deserved to understand her own situation. She pressed her hand against the side of her coat gently where the pain still lived in her ribs, like a slow fire that never quite went out, and she stared at the Montana road ahead, and she thought, "Evelyn Carter, you are in very serious trouble. Because you are starting to trust him. And you don't know yet whether that will save you or destroy you." The answer would come sooner than she expected. The first frost arrived in the last week of October. The ranch required work that couldn't wait supplies to move a section of roof to reinforce the root cellar to be packed and secured before the hard cold set in. Caleb worked from before dawn until after dark, and Evelyn worked beside him. She did not complain. She did not slow down. She was not going to be the person who slowed down. But on the third day of the hard push, she lifted a box of canned goods that was heavier than she'd estimated, and the angle was wrong. And for one terrible unguarded second, her ribs screamed with a pain so total and so absolute that the world went white at the edges. She didn't drop the box. She couldn't afford to drop the box. She set it down on the shelf with hands that were shaking, and she pressed herself against the wall of the root cellar, and she breathed carefully. 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 And she waited for the white to recede from the edges of her vision. And when she opened her eyes, Caleb was there. He had come in behind her. He had seen all of it. He stood in the doorway of the root cellar, and his expression was not angry, and it was not horrified, and it was not triumphant in the way that people's expressions sometimes become triumphant when they discover you have been keeping something from them. It was the expression of a man who had just understood something that had been sitting just out of reach for weeks. He was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than she could measure, and then, in that low, unhurried voice of his, he asked, "How long?" She looked at him. She had prepared for so many questions. She had not prepared for those 2 words. "What? How long have you been carrying that alone?" he said. And something in Evelyn Carter, something that had been locked and bolted and braced against the world for 11 weeks, or honestly, for years before that. Since long before the 11 weeks. Since long before the night that broke her ribs and her marriage and the life she had built from rubble and called survival. Something in her gave way, not all at once, not dramatically, just opened, like a door that had been held shut from the inside by sheer force of will, and the person holding it had simply run out of strength. 3 months, she whispered. And the tears came. The tears didn't come the way she expected. She had cried before, carefully alone in the dark, with her face pressed into a pillow so no one would hear. Those were controlled tears, managed tears. The kind you allow yourself in small doses because you know that if you open the door all the way, you might not be able to close it again. These were different. These started somewhere deeper than she had access to. Caleb didn't move toward her. He didn't reach for her. He just stayed in the doorway of the root cellar, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room, and he waited with the particular stillness of a man who understood that some things cannot be rushed and should not be. 3 months, she said again, because saying it out loud for the first time made it real in a way that nothing else had. 3 months of breathing in careful, shallow increments. 3 months of rewrapping the bandage every morning before anyone could see. 3 months of calculating every movement, how to lift, how to turn, how to sit down without flinching, how to stand up without gripping something for support. 3 months of being alone with it. Caleb stepped into the root cellar. He didn't take her hands. He didn't pull her into anything. He simply stood beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth from his coat, and he said quietly, "All right." Not, "I'm so sorry." Not, "You should have told me." Not, "How bad is it?" Just, "All right." Like he was telling her that whatever she had just opened, it was safe to leave it open. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth. She got the tears under control the way she always did through sheer determination and the habit of years. But something had already shifted. Something she could feel in her chest, in that locked-off place she didn't let herself examine. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Only if you want to." "I need to," she said, "because you deserve to know what you agreed to." He was quiet, listening. She took one careful breath and said, "The ribs weren't an accident." The silence that followed had a particular quality. Not shock, not the sharp intake of breath she might have expected, just attention, complete and steady attention. "My first husband," she said. "Thomas Marsh. He was a businessman in Baltimore, very well regarded, very respectable." She stopped. At home, he was something else entirely. She waited for the question. For the how long, or the how bad, or the why didn't you leave? The questions she had rehearsed answers to for weeks. Caleb didn't ask any of them, so she kept talking. She told him about the first year, which had seemed almost normal. The second year, when the small controls began, what she wore. Who she spoke to when she was allowed to leave the house. The third year, when the controls became something that left marks. She told him about learning to cover them, learning to explain them, learning to build a life inside the walls of a man's anger and call it marriage because she didn't know what else to call it. She told him about the night Thomas died. A riding accident, the doctor said. His horse had shied and thrown him. He had struck his head on a stone wall. He was gone before anyone reached him. She told him about the week after the funeral, when Thomas's older brother Franklin Marsh had come to the house. Franklin, who had always known more than he pretended to know, had looked at her bruised face and said something she would never forget. "You got what you wanted, but you won't keep it. I'll make sure of that." They started telling people I had driven him to it, she said. That I had been unfaithful, that I had been cruel, that whatever happened in that marriage was my fault because Thomas was a well-regarded man, and I was nobody from a family that no longer had a name worth protecting. She paused. They had lawyers. I had nothing. They contested the will. They froze every account. They told every person in Baltimore something that made me into a monster. She looked at her hands. And then 3 months ago, Franklin came to the house with 2 men I didn't know, and he told me I had 1 week to vacate the property. "And the ribs," Caleb said. His voice was so even, so quiet. "One of the men he brought," she said. "When I said I wasn't leaving without the papers that proved the accounts were mine." She stopped. "He made sure I understood that I didn't have a choice." The root cellar was very quiet. "So I left," she said. "I packed 1 bag. I took my father's book. I left everything else. And I read your advertisement in the Gazette, and I wrote you a letter, and I got on a train, and then another train, and then a stagecoach, and I did not stop moving until I was standing in the road in Silver Creek, because I knew that if I stopped moving, I would never start again." She finally looked up at him. His face had not changed. It was still that careful, steady face. But something in his eyes was different. A quality she couldn't name, something that lived between anger and grief, and was somehow neither of those things. "I should have told you before I came," she said. "You had the right to know what you were accepting." "Yes," he said. The word surprised her. "But you didn't deceive me," he said. "You survived. There's a difference. You're not angry." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm angry," he said, "but not at you." She hadn't thought about that as a possibility, the anger being aimed somewhere else, the anger being on her behalf rather than at her expense. She turned that over in her mind the way you turn over a coin you've never seen before, checking both sides, not quite sure it's real. "You need to see a doctor," he said. "I'm fine. You've had 3 broken ribs for 11 weeks that have been healing without proper care," he said with a gentleness that made the words land harder than she expected. "You're not fine. You're managing. Those are 2 different things." She opened her mouth. He said, "This isn't about whether you're strong enough to handle it. I know you're strong enough. I've watched you for 6 weeks. I know exactly how strong you are." A pause. "I'm asking because I don't want you to be in pain that doesn't have to continue." She closed her mouth. He said, "Doc Harlan is discreet. He's not a gossip. He'll look at the ribs and tell us what they need, and it won't go any further." She noticed the U.S. She noticed it very much. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow. Tonight," he said. She looked at him. "Tonight," he said again simply. And because she had learned in 6 weeks that Caleb Whitaker said very little that wasn't necessary, and nothing that wasn't true, she said, "Tonight." They went back to the house, and she changed her coat, and he hitched the wagon without another word. And by the time the stars were coming out over Silver Creek, they were on the road to town. Doc Harlan's office was on the north end of the main street, a single-room building with a light burning in the window. He was a man of about 60, with spectacles and a manner so professionally neutral that Evelyn felt her shoulders come down an inch the moment she walked in. Caleb told him what he needed to know. The minimum, just the ribs, just the timeline, and then he stepped out into the hall without being asked, closing the door behind him, giving her the privacy of the examination without her having to request it. She thought about that as Doc Harlan checked the ribs with careful hands. She thought about how Caleb had anticipated again the thing she needed before she knew how to ask for it. "2 of them have healed reasonably well," Doc Harlan said. "Not perfectly, but they'll do. The 3rd one." He paused. "This one's given you trouble." "Yes," she said. "It's partially healed but not correctly. You've been putting strain on it." "I've been working. I can see that." He didn't say it with judgment. "There's not much to do at this stage but support it properly and stop asking it to carry more than it should. I'm going to show you how to wrap it correctly, and I'm going to give you something for the pain that won't make you foggy." He looked at her over his spectacles. "And you need to tell that man out there what you can and cannot lift, because he's going to keep working you like a ranch hand if you don't." She almost laughed. "He doesn't mean to," Doc Harlan added. "He's just used to people telling him when something's wrong. He's not the type to push someone past their limit on purpose." "No," she said. "He isn't." She said it with more certainty than she expected, and the certainty sat comfortably in her chest, and she noticed that too. When she came out of the examination room, Caleb was sitting in the hall with his hat in his hands. He looked up immediately. "Well," he said, "2 are mostly healed. The 3rd needs more time and proper wrapping." She paused. "He gave me medicine for the pain." "Good." She looked at him. "You can stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I might fall over." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. "I'll try," he said. They walked out into the cold street together, and the night was very dark and very quiet, and the stars over Silver Creek were the kind of stars that only exist that far from any city bright enough to cast faint shadows. And Evelyn walked beside Caleb Whitaker, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Safe. Not safe from everything. Not safe from the Marsh family, or from Richard Holloway, or from the particular cruelties the world had shown her it was capable of. But safe from whatever was going to happen in the next 10 feet. Safe from the next 10 minutes. That was something. That was right now enough. She was still deciding what to do with that feeling when Richard Holloway stepped out of the saloon across the street and saw them. She didn't know who he was at first. She only knew that the man who stepped off the saloon porch was looking at them with the particular expression of someone who has just found exactly what he was looking for. He was well dressed for Silver Creek, Too well dressed in the way of men who use their clothes to tell you they're a different class of person than you are. He had a broad face and a manner that was all warmth on the surface and something else entirely underneath, and he crossed the street toward them with his hands extended as if this were a chance encounter between old friends. "Caleb," he said. "Evening." "Holloway," Caleb said. Nothing in his voice. Not cold, not warm, just flat. Holloway's eyes moved to Evelyn with undisguised interest. "And this must be the famous mail-order bride," he said with a smile that didn't touch anything above his mouth. "We've been hearing about you, Mrs. Marsh," she said. It came out before she thought about it. Her married name, the name she had been running from for 3 months. Holloway's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened like a blade being drawn. "Marsh," he said. "That's an Eastern name." "Is it?" she said. "Baltimore, if I had to guess." The cold that went through her had nothing to do with the Montana night air. He knew, or he was guessing very precisely. Either way, this man Caleb had warned her about the man with the bank and the land ambitions and the instinct for leverage, had just let her know that he had been doing research. "It's a very common name," she said pleasantly. "I wouldn't read too much into it." Holloway looked at her for a moment with those sharp, calculating eyes, and then he laughed a big social laugh designed to be heard and clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "Smart woman," he said. "You've done well, Caleb." Caleb said nothing. "We should have dinner sometime," Holloway said. "All 3 of us. Catch up." His eyes went back to Evelyn, and this time the smile was smaller and more honest, which made it worse. "I'm sure we have a great deal to talk about." He walked away. They stood on the street and watched him go. Caleb said without turning to her, "How much does he know?" "I don't know," Evelyn said. "Enough to worry about." "Does the Marsh family have reached this far west?" She had been asking herself the same question since Franklin Marsh had looked her in the eye at the funeral and made his promise. "I'll make sure of that." Franklin Marsh was a meticulous man. He was the kind of man who finished what he started. "I don't know," she said again, "but I think we need to assume they might." Caleb nodded once. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." And they did. The drive back was different from the drive to town. Something had changed in the architecture of the silence between them. It was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. A shared quiet, rather than 2 separate quiets occupying the same space. She was aware of him beside her, in a way she hadn't fully let herself be aware before, and she thought he was probably aware of the same shift, though neither of them said anything about it. She was thinking about Franklin Marsh. She was thinking about Holloway's eyes when she said her name. She was thinking about the fact that she had come 2,000 miles and changed her name in her own head and built a new life out of almost nothing, and the past had still found a way to reach its hand around the corner and tap her on the shoulder. "Tell me about Holloway," she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then, "He came to Silver Creek 4 years ago with a bank draft and a plan. He bought out the old Miller homestead when it went under in a dry year. Then the Pearson place when old Edwin Pearson had that hard winter. He's smart about timing. He shows up when people are desperate, and he makes offers that look fair until you read the terms. And your land. My land sits between his 2 largest properties. He needs it to build the combined spread he's been engineering for the last 2 years. A pause. He's made me 3 offers. I've turned all 3 down. What does he do when people say no? The question sat between them for a moment. He finds another way, Caleb said. She thought about that. She thought about a man who had just learned her name. Her real name. The name attached to a scandal that the Marsh family had been very carefully constructing for 3 months in Baltimore, 5,000 miles from Silver Creek, long before Evelyn could arrive here to offer any other version of the story. "He's going to use me," she said. Caleb glanced at her. "Your reputation," she said. "Whatever Franklin Marsh has been saying about me in Baltimore Holloway is going to bring it here. He's going to use it to make people question your judgment, your character. If you're seen as a man who is foolish enough to bring a disreputable woman to Silver Creek, or worse, a woman with real scandal attached to her name. I don't care what people say about my judgment, Caleb said. You should, she said, because it won't just be about your judgment. It'll be about your business dealings, your standing with the bank, whether men who owe you money bother to pay it back, whether men who respect you now decide there's something to question. She turned to look at him directly. I've watched this happen before. This is exactly how it's done. He was quiet. I can leave, she said. If I leave now before Holloway puts the story in circulation, then there's nothing attached to you. You're just a man whose arrangement fell through. That's not uncommon. The wagon kept moving. Caleb said, no, just that. One word. Caleb, I said no. She stared at him. The plains were very dark and very open around them, and the only light was the stars and the wagon lamp. And his face was in partial shadow, and he was looking straight ahead at the road. You don't owe me anything, she said. I came here with things I didn't tell you, with problems I didn't disclose. You would have every right to, Evelyn. His voice was quiet, not sharp, not a rebuke, just her name with enough weight in it to stop her. She stopped. I'm not sending you away, he said. That's not something I'm going to do, so let's not have this conversation again. She looked at him for a long time. Why not? She said. It wasn't quite a question. He thought about it for a moment in the unhurried way he thought about most things. Because you came here for a chance, he said. And I said I'd give you one. And I'm not the kind of man who takes that back because it turns out the chance was harder than he expected. She turned back to face the road. Her chest hurt, not from the ribs. She pressed her lips together and said nothing else. But inside, the silence, something shifted that she couldn't shift back, and she stopped trying. The next morning she started writing. She had been a careful record keeper her entire adult life, first from habit, then from necessity, and finally as the only form of self-protection she had access to. In Baltimore, she had kept a journal of dates and incidents and specific words spoken, because she had understood early that Thomas Marsh would always deny and documentation was the only form of truth that couldn't be argued with. She had not brought that journal west. She had left it in a box beneath a floorboard in the house that was no longer hers because she hadn't dared carry it with her. If Franklin Marsh's men had searched her bags, and they would have, if they'd had the chance, the journal would have told him exactly how much she knew about his family's dealings. And that would have been dangerous in ways she hadn't been ready to manage, but she remembered everything in it, every date, every amount, every name. She started writing it from memory. She wrote at the kitchen table early in the mornings before Caleb came in from the first chores in a notebook she had found in the pantry that had been used for ranch accounts. She wrote in small, careful letters. Dates, figures, names, transactions she had overheard, conversations she had not been supposed to hear. Thomas had been careless with what he said in his own house because he had not considered his wife a threat. That had been his most significant mistake. Franklin Marsh was smarter than his brother, but he had made the same error on the day he had sent men to her house to intimidate her into leaving. He had assumed that a woman who was already beaten would not be paying careful attention to what was said in that room. She had been paying very careful attention. She wrote for an hour and a half every morning and then put the notebook under the loose board she had found in the bedroom floor on her second day in the house. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it was hers. On the fifth morning, Caleb came in from the barn earlier than usual and found her at the table. She closed the notebook quickly. He looked at it, then at her. "Breakfast in a minute," she said. "Take your time," he said. He poured himself coffee from the pot and stood by the stove, and she waited for the question, and the question didn't come. After a moment, she said, "I'm documenting things I remember, from Baltimore. Financial records mainly, conversations." He waited. "The Marsh family transferred property under terms that weren't legal," she said. "My husband signed things he wasn't authorized to sign. I know what I heard. If it ever matters." "It matters now," Caleb said. She looked up. Holloway's been buying out properties using the same bank, he said. The Territorial Land Office has had 2 complaints in the last year that went nowhere. The judge who would have heard them has a loan from Holloway's bank. He set his coffee down. What you know and what you've written down might matter more than you realize. She stared at him. How do you know all that? I've been paying attention for 2 years, he said. I just didn't have the legal knowledge to know what I was looking at. She looked down at the notebook. 2 people, she thought. 2 people who had been separately gathering pieces of the same picture. And the picture was larger than she had understood. I need to know everything, she said. Everything you know about Holloway's land transactions. All right. Tonight, after supper. All right, he said again. And for the first time since she had arrived in Silver Creek, Evelyn Carter felt something that was not simply survival, and was not simply endurance, and was not simply the grim mechanical continuation of getting through one day and then the next. She felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she had something to fight for. Not just her own life. A different kind of fight, the kind where you go forward rather than simply refusing to go back. She stood up from the table and put the notebook away and started making breakfast. And Caleb drank his coffee in the quiet kitchen, and neither of them said anything more because neither of them needed to. The plan was already forming, and somewhere in Silver Creek, Richard Holloway was doing the same. The only question now was which of them moved first. Holloway moved first. They moved. She should have expected it. She had watched men like him operate her entire adult life. Men who understood that the most effective weapon was not confrontation, but erosion. You didn't destroy a person all at once. You loosened the ground beneath them slowly, until they sank without anyone being able to point to the exact moment it happened. It started with Martha Hale. 3 days after the encounter on the main street, Evelyn went into town for thread, and found the dry goods store quieter than usual when she walked in. Not empty, there were 2 women at the far counter she recognized from Sunday service. But when she entered, the conversation stopped in the particular way that conversations stop when the person they were about has just walked through the door. Martha Hale smiled with every tooth she had. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, and the half-second pause before the name was deliberate and precise. Evelyn set her list on the counter. "Good morning, Martha. I need 6 yards of cotton flannel and whatever you have in brown wool thread." "Of course." Martha began moving along the shelves. "We were just talking about you, actually." "Were you?" Evelyn said. "Someone mentioned that they had connections in Baltimore. Said the name Marsh came up in some interesting context." She set the flannel on the counter and looked up with eyes that were entirely too bright. "You wouldn't know anything about that, I imagine." The 2 women at the far counter had stopped pretending to look at buttons. Evelyn looked at the flannel. She looked at the thread Martha placed beside it. She took her time because she had learned years ago that the worst thing you can do in a room that is waiting for you to panic is oblige it. "Baltimore is a large city," she said pleasantly. "A great many things happen there." She opened her purse and counted out exact change. "I'm sure whatever your friend heard was fascinating." She took her purchases and left. She didn't walk fast. She did not give them the satisfaction of watching her hurry. But the moment she was out of sight of the store window, she stopped walking and stood very still and pressed her hand flat against the side of her coat. Not from the pain in her ribs, but from the pain of knowing that it had begun. The thing she had feared. The story she had run 2,000 miles to get away from it had arrived ahead of her, or caught up with her, or been delivered by someone with enough resources to reach this far, and enough motivation to use them. Franklin Marsh. She was certain of it now. The only question was what shape the story had taken by the time it reached Silver Creek, and whether Holloway had received it already, or was still waiting for the details to sharpen. She went to find Caleb. He was at the livery stable having a shoe reset on the gray mare, and when she walked in and he looked up and saw her face, he handed the lead rope to the stable boy without a word and came to her. "What happened?" he said. She told him. Quickly and clearly, the way she had learned to report things, Facts first, interpretation after. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's testing the water, he said. He doesn't know exactly what he has yet. If he had the full story, he'd have moved bigger than a conversation in a dry goods store. He's building it, she said. Piece by piece. He puts the name in circulation, watches the reaction, measures how much damage it does, and then he decides how much more to add. Caleb looked at her. You've seen this before. I've lived it before, she said. Something moved through his expression, brief and controlled, but she caught it. A heat that was not anger at her, but something adjacent to fury at the situation, at the men who made situations like this, at the whole machinery of it. We need to move before he does, she said. What are you thinking? The land records, she said. You said Holloway's been buying through the Territorial Bank using irregular terms. I need to see the actual filings, the deed transfers, the mortgage assignments. The Territorial Land Office keeps copies, but they're not public access. Who has access? The clerk, Judge Harding. You said Harding has a loan from Holloway's bank. Yes. Then not Harding, she said. Who else? He thought for a moment. There's a land attorney in the county seat. Name's Aldrich. He's not connected to Holloway as far as I know. He turned down a retainer from him 2 years ago, which in this county means something. Can you get me a meeting with Aldrich? Caleb studied her. You know land law. I know document fraud, she said. I know what a falsified transfer looks like. I know what a coerced signature looks like. I know what it means when the dates on a recording don't align with the dates on the underlying deed. She met his eyes. My husband ran 3 businesses through a firm that operated on the wrong side of legal. I spent 5 years watching him. I learned everything I could because knowledge was the only thing he couldn't take away from me. Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, I'll write to Aldrich tonight. She nodded. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way she had taught herself to think in Baltimore, in the years when thinking ahead was the only thing that kept the walls from closing in entirely. She was thinking about what Holloway knew and what he didn't know, and what the gap between those 2 things might give her room to do. She was thinking about the notebook under the floorboard in her bedroom. She was thinking about Franklin Marsh and the specific things he had said in that room in Baltimore, and the specific things the men with him had said, and whether any of it was enough. And then she stopped thinking about that, because she needed to think about one thing at a time, and right now the one thing was Holloway. One problem at a time. She had learned that too. She walked back to the wagon with Caleb, and the town of Silver Creek went about its morning around them, and she kept her back straight and her head level and gave no one anything to read in her face, because she was not going to let them see her run scared again. She was done running. The letter to Aldrich went out that night. In the meantime, the rumors moved through Silver Creek with the particular speed that rumors move through small towns, faster than truth, more certain than fact, louder than anything she could say to counter them. She heard fragments. She was not supposed to hear them, but she did. A woman at the well who stopped talking when Evelyn approached. A man at the feed store who looked at Caleb with an expression that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and judgmental. A note left at the post office that Caleb intercepted before she saw it, but whose existence he confirmed when she asked him directly. What did it say? Nothing worth repeating. Caleb. He looked at her. It said you were a woman of questionable character, and that I had been taken advantage of by someone with an agenda. She absorbed that. Who sent it? No signature. Holloway. Almost certainly. She thought for a moment. What did you do with it? He reached into his coat pocket and handed it to her. She read it once carefully. It was unsigned, handwritten, in a neat script she didn't recognize, printed on good paper. Not the kind of paper available at the Silver Creek General Store. The kind of paper that came from a well-stocked private office. I want to keep this, she said. He nodded. She folded it and put it in her pocket. Evidence. It was small, but it was something. A handwriting sample. A paper stock that could be traced. She had learned in Baltimore that the smallest details were sometimes the most damning, because people who thought they were being clever were rarely careful about the small things. That same week, 2 men came to the ranch. She was in the kitchen when she heard them ride up, and she looked out and saw them tying their horses at the postmen she didn't recognize, dressed for town, not for ranch work. Something about the way they sat their horses set off every instinct she had developed over years of learning to read rooms before she walked into them. She was at the front door before Caleb reached it. "Go inside," he said quietly. "No." He looked at her. "No," she said again, evenly. "Whatever they came here to say, I'll hear it standing beside you." Something passed through his expression, not argument, something closer to acknowledgement. He opened the door. The older of the 2 men was perhaps 50, with a practiced smile that he deployed like a tool. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm Mr. Cole, representing Mr. Holloway's financial interest in the territory. This is Mr. Briscoe." "I know who you work for," Caleb said. Cole's smile didn't waver. His eyes moved to Evelyn and stayed there. "And you must be Mrs. Marsh." "Miss Carter," she said. "Of course." He said it with just enough of a pause to be an insult. Mr. Holloway wanted to convey his regards. He's been made aware of certain complications in your background, and he wanted Mr. Whitaker to have the full picture before things progressed any further between you. "Mr. Holloway can convey his regards in person," Caleb said, "if he has something to say." "He thought this would be more comfortable," Cole said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Some correspondence from Baltimore regarding Miss Carter's former situation. Evelyn's heart went cold and kept moving. She knew what was in that envelope before Cole extended it. She knew because she had spent years watching Thomas Marsh build exactly this kind of file on people he wanted to control, and she recognized the shape of the weapon even before she saw the contents. Caleb didn't take the envelope. "Get off my land," he said. Cole's smile finally lost some of its certainty. "Mr. Whitaker, I think if you'd just read, 'I said get off my land.'" His voice was still quiet. That was the thing about Caleb. He didn't raise his voice when he was serious. He lowered it. "And tell Holloway that the next time he sends men to my property uninvited, I'll be the one riding into town, and the conversation won't be as pleasant as this one." Cole looked at Evelyn one more time, measuring the look of a man deciding whether the asset is worth the trouble. She held his gaze without blinking. He put the envelope back in his coat. The 2 men rode away. She and Caleb stood on the porch until they were out of sight, and then Caleb turned to her and said, "Tell me what was in that envelope." She let out a slow breath. "Everything Franklin Marsh has been building for 3 months," she said. "Statements from people in Baltimore. Some of them true in fragments. Most of them constructed. There will be something about Thomas's death suggesting I was responsible in some way or complicit. There will be something about the finances suggesting I took money that wasn't mine. There will be character statements from people whose names I'll recognize, people who owed Thomas favors." She paused. "It will look very convincing. It's designed to look convincing." Caleb was watching her steadily. "How much of it is true?" he said. She appreciated that he asked directly. "I left that house with 1 suitcase," she said. "I took nothing that was mine by law, because by law, nothing was mine. Thomas made certain of that years before he died." She looked at him. "I did not cause his accident. I grieved him the only way I knew how, which was to be relieved that it was over, and I will not apologize for that." A pause. "Everything else in that file is architecture, a structure built from true pieces arranged to make a false picture." "I believe you," he said. Immediately, without hesitation. She had not fully prepared herself for that. "You don't have to—" Evelyn. Again her name. That particular weight. "I have known you for 6 weeks. I have watched you every single day. I know what kind of person you are." He held her gaze. "I believe you." She nodded once because it was all she could manage. "Now," he said, "tell me what we need to do." What they needed, she told him, was to stop playing defense. Every move they made now in response to Holloway was a move they'd already lost. He set the agenda, they reacted, and the town watched them react, and every reaction could be interpreted as evidence of guilt or desperation, or both. They needed to change the shape of the game. That was the phrase she used, and Caleb looked at her with something that might have been surprise, and might have been recognition. "You've done this before," he said. "I've survived it before," she said. "That's not the same thing, but I learned." The letter to Aldrich came back in 9 days. He would see them. The county seat was a day's ride, and they left before dawn on a Thursday, and the drive was long and cold, and they talked the whole way there, really talked the way they had been circling without quite committing, in fragments and implications and careful approaches. She told him more about Baltimore. He told her more about Silver Creek, about Holloway's acquisitions, about the 2 families who had sold under what he now suspected was coercion. She told him about the notebook. She had been waiting for the right moment, and somewhere on that cold road, with the sun just rising behind the hills, she decided the right moment was now. "I've been writing down everything I remember from Baltimore," she said. "Dates, amounts, names, conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "How complete is it?" "Complete enough," she said. "Thomas's firm did business with 4 other families in Baltimore and 1 in Philadelphia. The pattern was always the same: loans, extended under favorable terms. Conditions altered quietly after signing, pressure applied when payments were disputed. I have dates. I have specific figures I heard. I have the name of the lawyer who drew the documents because he came to the house once when he thought I wasn't home." Caleb was quiet. "The same pattern Holloway's using," she said. He turned to look at her. "The same exact pattern," she said. "Different territory, different names, but the same mechanics." She watched him put it together. "You think they're connected," he said. "I think a man running the same scheme in 2 different territories is either independently imaginative," she said, "or he learned it from the same place." The silence that followed had a different quality than their other silences. This one was full, packed with implication. "Thomas Marsh's family has money in 3 Western territories," she said. "I found correspondence, once a letter I wasn't supposed to see because he'd left it on his desk, and I had learned to read documents upside down. It mentioned investments in Montana and Wyoming. Land investments." She paused. "I didn't understand it at the time. I understand it now." Caleb's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Holloway is working with the Marsh family," he said. "I think Holloway may be working for the Marsh family," she said. "Or the Marsh family is working with the same network Holloway belongs to. Either way, when Franklin sent me west, he may not have simply been running me out of Baltimore." She let that sit. She watched Caleb work through it. "He may have sent you towards something he knew was here," he said slowly. "Because a scandal attached to my name, a woman with a dark past who came west and involved herself with a rancher, is exactly the kind of thing that gives Holloway the leverage he needs to pressure you." She said it without inflection. Factually. "I was the instrument. Whether Franklin planned it from the beginning or simply saw an opportunity when he realized where I had gone, I don't know, but the result is the same." The road to the county seat stretched ahead of them. Caleb said nothing for a long time. When he did speak, his voice was very quiet. "Evelyn." "Yes." "If all of this is true, the connection between Holloway and the Marsh family, then you didn't just escape Baltimore." "No," she said. "You walked into the center of it." "Yes," she said. "I know." He was quiet again. Then, "That makes you the most important person in this whole situation." She hadn't thought about it in those terms. She had thought about it in terms of danger, in terms of exposure, in terms of being the person who carried the information that both sides of a very large conspiracy would prefer to keep buried. She had not thought about herself as important. She thought about it now. "The notebook matters more than I realized," she said. "The notebook might be everything," he said. Dawn. Aldrich was not what she expected. She had braced herself for skepticism. For the look men sometimes gave her in professional settings, the look that assessed her and found her to be a woman in a room where women were tolerated rather than consulted. Aldrich listened. He was a small man of about 55, with reading spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and the unhurried manner of someone who has seen a great deal and been surprised very little. He sat behind a desk covered in organized papers, and he listened to everything she said without interrupting once. When she finished, he took off his spectacles and cleaned them and put them back on. "Miss Carter," he said, "I turned down a retainer from Richard Holloway 2 years ago because I looked at the first property transfer he brought me, and I didn't like the smell of it. I have been waiting with perhaps more patience than the situation deserved for someone to walk through that door with enough to do something about it." He looked at her steadily. "You may have just done that." She reached into her bag and produced the notebook. He looked at it. He looked at her. He opened it and read for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up. "Where did you store this?" "Under a floorboard in my bedroom." "I'd recommend something more secure going forward." He looked back at the notebook. "This is admissible as a personal record if you can testify to the circumstances under which you made it. The question is the corroboration." "Tell me what you need corroborated," she said, "and I'll tell you if I can get it." They worked for 3 hours. Caleb sat beside her for all of it, and he asked questions at the right moments and was quiet at the right moments, and she was aware of him throughout, aware that he was tracking every word, building the same picture she was building, making himself useful without taking over a situation that she was leading. She noticed this the way she had noticed everything else about him. When they stood to leave, Aldrich shook her hand across the desk. "You understand that if this proceeds," he said carefully, "you will be visible. There's no way to use this information without people knowing where it came from." "I understand," she said. "Holloway will fight back. The Marsh family, if they are indeed involved, will fight back. It will not be pleasant." "It already isn't pleasant," she said. "At least this way something comes of it." He looked at her for a moment over his spectacles. "Your husband's firm," he said. "Were you afraid of him?" The question was quiet and direct. "Every day," she said. "For years." He nodded once. "And now?" She thought about it. "Now I'm angry," she said. "That's different." He smiled a small private smile, the kind that means someone has confirmed something they suspected. "Yes," he said. "It is." On the road home in the cold dark of a Montana evening with a sky full of stars, she was beginning to recognize and land, she was beginning to understand. Evelyn sat beside Caleb and felt the anger she had described to Aldrich move through her like something being restructured. Not the hot, chaotic anger of fear. The cold, clean anger of clarity. She knew what she had. She knew what it meant. She knew what she was going to do with it, and she knew it would cost her, and she had decided somewhere in Aldrich's office that the cost was not something she was going to let stop her. "Are you all right?" Caleb said. She thought about the question honestly, the way she was beginning to think about his questions, because he asked things that deserved honest answers, and giving him automatic reassurances felt like a waste of both their time. "I'm afraid," she said. "And I'm more angry than afraid, which is the first time that equation has balanced that way in a long time." He nodded. "Good," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "Fear makes you careful," he said. "Anger makes you move." A pause. "You need both, but if you only have one, anger's the one that gets things done." She turned to look at the dark road ahead. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly." "All right. Are you afraid of what's coming?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. She nodded. "Good," she said. And somewhere in the dark, on the road between the county seat and Silver Creek, something that had been tentative and careful between them shifted into something else. Something grounded. Something mutual. Something that neither of them named because neither of them needed to. They were in this together, not by accident, and not by obligation, and not by the terms of an advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette. by choice. Back at the ranch that night, she retrieved the notebook from under the floorboard and placed it inside the lining of her traveling bag, which she locked and put under the bed. Then she lay awake for a long time thinking about Holloway and Franklin Marsh, and the shape of what was coming, and the anger she carried didn't let her sleep. But for the first time, the thing keeping her awake was not fear. And in the room at the end of the hall, Caleb Whitaker lay awake too. And whatever he was thinking, he didn't let himself stop until he had thought it all the way through. Because something was coming, and they were out of time to be unprepared for it. Holloway moved on a Tuesday. She had known it was coming. The signs had been there for days, the particular silence that falls over a town when something is about to happen that everyone can feel, but no one will say out loud. The way men looked at Caleb at the feed store and looked away too quickly. The way Martha Hale had stopped making pointed comments and started making no comments at all, which was somehow worse. Silence in a gossip is never peace. It's preparation. The knock on the ranch door came at mid-morning, and it wasn't Holloway's men this time. It was Sheriff Beaumont, a broad, red-faced man of about 55, who had the particular expression of someone doing a job he doesn't enjoy on behalf of a person he doesn't respect. Caleb opened the door. Evelyn stood 3 feet behind him. "Caleb," Beaumont said. He took his hat off, which was either courtesy or apology. "I've got a civil complaint lodged with the territorial court regarding property held in your name." He paused. "And a separate matter involving your guest." "My fiancée," Caleb said. Beaumont looked uncomfortable. "Yes, sir. I have a deposition from a Mr. Franklin Marsh of Baltimore, Maryland, alleging that a woman traveling under the name Evelyn Carter is in fact Evelyn Marsh, widow wanted in the state of Maryland in connection with a disputed estate, and allegations of," he consulted the paper, "fraud in the administration of a deceased person's property." The word fraud landed in the room like a stone. Evelyn didn't move. She had prepared herself for this. She had known since the night she watched Holloway's men ride away from the porch that this moment was coming. She had rehearsed her response in her own mind probably 40 times in the last 2 weeks. It still hit her like ice water. "Those allegations are false," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "And they are the product of a contested estate dispute in which Mr. Franklin Marsh is himself a party with direct financial interest in discrediting me." Beaumont looked at her. He was not a stupid man. She could see him weighing things behind his eyes. "Be that as it may," he said, "I have a legal obligation to—" "What's the civil complaint against me?" Caleb said. Beaumont shifted. "Holloway's filing a challenge to the eastern boundary survey of your property. Claims the original 1877 survey was improperly recorded, and that 60 acres you've been working fall under his adjacent claim." 60 acres. Evelyn's mind moved immediately. 60 acres, that was the creek land. The water access. Without the creek access, Caleb's cattle had no reliable water source through the dry months. Without water, the ranch wasn't viable. Without the ranch, there was no leverage, no standing, no home. It wasn't about the 60 acres. It was about the water. It was always about the water. "When was this filed?" she said. Beaumont looked at her. "Yesterday morning. And the deposition from Franklin Marsh. Arrived by telegraph relay Friday. Formalized yesterday." She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. The same thought moving through both of them simultaneously. Friday. The deposition had arrived Friday. Holloway had coordinated it deliberately, filing both actions together to create a single, overwhelming pressure point. 2 problems at once. That was the tactic. That was always the tactic. Not one blow you could absorb and recover from, but 2 simultaneous strikes designed so that defending against one left you exposed on the other. "Sheriff," she said, "am I under arrest?" Beaumont looked pained. "No, ma'am. The deposition is a request for extradition proceedings. That goes through the territorial governor's office. It'll take time." "How much time?" "Weeks, maybe longer. The governor's office is backed up, and Maryland's a long way from here." He paused. "But I'd recommend you don't travel outside the territory in the interim. I have no intention of going anywhere, she said. Beaumont nodded. He looked at Caleb. The land survey challenge, you'll need to respond to the territorial court within 30 days. After that, it goes to hearing. 30 days, Caleb said. Yes, sir. Beaumont put his hat back on. He looked at them both with something she might have called reluctant sympathy, if she'd trusted it. For what it's worth, he said quietly, and then stopped, as if he'd decided not to say what he'd started to say. Say it, Caleb said. Beaumont was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I've been sheriff here for 11 years, and I've watched Holloway operate for the last 4. I don't like this. He looked down at his hat. That's not something I can put in an official document, but I wanted you to know. He left. Caleb closed the door. For a moment, they stood in the kitchen without speaking. Outside, the day was moving along normally, wind against the walls, the sound of the cattle at the far end of the property, the perfectly ordinary sounds of a life that was now under threat from 2 directions simultaneously. 30 days, Caleb said. We don't need 30 days, Evelyn said. We need 2 weeks. He looked at her. Aldrich is ready to file, she said. I had a letter from him yesterday I was going to tell you tonight. He's found corroboration on 2 of the property transfers, the Pearson land and the old Miller place. The recording dates don't match the notarization dates on the underlying deeds. Someone altered the filings after the fact. Caleb went very still. He needs the original survey records for your eastern boundary, she said. The 1877 filing. If the original is clean and Holloway's challenge is based on an altered copy, then the challenge collapses. The original would be at the Territorial Land Office. Yes. Which is under the jurisdiction of Judge Harding, she said. I know. They looked at each other. The problem with Harding was the problem with all of it. A man who held debt from Holloway's bank was a man whose decisions would bend in a particular direction, regardless of what the evidence showed. Not because he was evil necessarily. Because he was compromised, which in the end produced the same result. There's a territorial circuit judge who comes through every 3 months, Caleb said slowly. Judge Ellison. He's not from here. He doesn't have accounts at Holloway's bank. When does he come through? 6 weeks. She shook her head. Too long. Holloway will have the extradition moving through the governor's office by then, and even if it takes time, the process itself is enough to damage us. The moment it becomes a public proceeding, every rumor he's been seeding in Silver Creek becomes official record. So we need Harding. Or we need to go over Harding. Caleb frowned. How? She pulled out the letter from Aldrich and set it on the kitchen table. He mentioned something at the end. A federal land commissioner who has oversight authority over all territorial land office records. Federal, not territorial. Harding has no jurisdiction over a federal inquiry. Caleb read the letter. She watched his eyes move down the page. A federal filing takes time, he said. Aldrich says 2 weeks minimum, but the filing itself creates an automatic hold on any related territorial proceedings. She tapped the page. If we file federally before Holloway's land challenge goes to Harding, everything freezes, including the challenge, including any action on the extradition that requires local court support. He looked up. That buys us time. That buys us everything, she said. Because in that time, Aldrich presents the fraudulent transfer evidence. If the federal commissioner finds the land office records have been tampered with, that opens an investigation into every transaction that touched those records, including Holloway's bank. The kitchen was very quiet. Including, she said carefully, whatever financial relationship exists between Holloway's bank and Franklin Marsh's interests in Baltimore. Caleb set the letter down. He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read, that particular look of his that lived somewhere between calculation and something warmer, something he kept at a careful distance from the surface. You've been building this since the night we met with Aldrich, he said. I've been building this since the night I read your advertisement in the Gazette, she said. I just didn't know the specific shape until I understood what Holloway was doing. A pause. I need you to do something for me, she said. Name it. I need you to go to the two families who sold to Holloway, the Pearsons, whoever's left of the Miller family. I need you to ask them carefully privately whether they felt they had a real choice when they sold." His jaw tightened. "And if they say no, then they're potential witnesses," she said, "and witnesses change the shape of a legal case considerably." He nodded once. "When do I go?" "Today," she said. "This afternoon, before Holloway hears about Beaumont's visit and decides to accelerate his timeline." He was reaching for his coat before she finished the sentence. "Sir." He came back 4 hours later. She had spent those 4 hours at the kitchen table with every document she had, organizing them into an order that Aldrich could use her notebook. Transcriptions, the note that had been left at the post office, a record of the dates and contents of every interaction with Holloway's men, a timeline she had constructed from memory of the Baltimore transactions cross-referenced with the dates Aldrich had identified in the territorial records. When she heard the horse in the yard, she didn't look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing first. Caleb came through the door and stood for a moment without speaking, and she looked up and saw his face and put her pen down. "Edwin Pearson's widow is still alive," he said. 63 years old, lives with her daughter-in-law in town. And she said Holloway came to her 3 weeks after Edwin died. She said he had a document already prepared, told her it was a standard form that she needed to sign within the week, or the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings on a debt she hadn't known existed. He paused. She signed because she was alone and frightened, and the debt was real. Edwin had borrowed against the property without telling her. Was the foreclosure threat legitimate? Aldrich would need to verify. But she said Holloway's man told her she had no legal options, that contesting the debt would cost more than the land was worth, and that she should take his offer and be grateful. His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. "She's 73. She and Edwin built that place from nothing." Evelyn's hand tightened on her pen. "Will she testify?" She said she would. He sat down across from her. She said, He stopped. "What?" She said she'd been wanting someone to ask her for 4 years. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. 4 years of waiting for someone to ask. She opened her eyes. "The Millers. The son is in Wyoming, but there's a daughter. Rebecca Farrow married name, lives 15 miles north. She says her father signed the original sale under the impression it was a lease agreement with an option to buy back. He died believing he still owned the land." Caleb looked at the table. She found the actual documents after the funeral and didn't know what to do with them. "She has the documents. She has copies, kept them in a box under her bed." Evelyn stared at him. "Caleb," she said, "I know. She has copies of the original documents." "I know." "That's not a case," she said. "That's a conviction." He looked at her across the table, and for one moment, just one, the careful distance he kept from his own expression wasn't quite enough, and she saw what was underneath it. Not just the anger at Holloway, or the satisfaction of having found what they needed. Something directed at her specifically. Something that recognized her specifically. "I need to ride to Aldrich," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Tonight you're going to eat supper and rest." She started to object. "Evelyn." That voice, her name with the weight in it. "We have the documents. We have the witnesses. We have your notebook and the federal filing and 2 weeks of Aldrich's preparation." He held her gaze. "One night won't change that, and you haven't slept properly in 3 days." She wanted to argue. She didn't. Because he was right, and more than that, because she was beginning to understand that when Caleb Whitaker said something like, "Eat supper and rest," he wasn't managing her, or diminishing her, or trying to take over the situation. He was simply seeing that she was human, which was something she had stopped expecting people to notice. "All right," she said. "Tonight." He cooked supper. She hadn't expected that either. He made it without ceremony. Beans and cornbread and coffee, and he put it on the table and sat down, and they ate, and the conversation was quiet and practical, and moved through the details of what Aldrich would need in the morning. And underneath the practicality was something else. Something neither of them addressed directly, the way you can sit beside a fire and not talk about the warmth. After supper, she washed the dishes and he dried them, which was something they had fallen into as a habit without discussing it, and the kitchen was warm, and outside, the Montana night was very dark and very cold, and she was aware of standing beside him in a way that was different from the first weeks, not managed or calculated, but simply present. Aware of the specific weight of him beside her, the specific quality of the silence. She handed him the last cup. He dried it. Neither of them moved toward the door. "When this is over," she said. "Yes, I want to stay." She said it plainly without performance, looking at the window above the basin. "Not because I don't have anywhere else to go. I have options. Aldrich has already said that if the federal case proceeds, I may have a legitimate claim to recover some of what the Marsh family took. I could go back east. I could start somewhere new." She paused. "I want to stay here. I want you to know that it's a choice." He was quiet. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that careful face, and underneath it was that thing she could see now when he didn't quite manage to conceal it. "I know," he said. "That's the only version of it I'd want." She nodded. She turned back to the window. "Good," she said. "Then that's settled." And somehow, in the most quiet and practical way imaginable, something that had been holding its breath for weeks finally let it out. She rode to Aldrich the next morning. Not with Caleb. He needed to be at the ranch, visible normal, giving Holloway no signal that anything had changed. She went with a rifle in the saddle scabbard and the travel bag with the notebook in the lining, and she rode the county road in the cold morning light and thought about all of it. Aldrich had the documents. Rebecca Farrow's copies within the hour. He read them at his desk with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead, a habit he had when he was concentrating hard, and the longer he read, the stiller he became in the way that lawyers become still when they are looking at something significant. "This is the original agreement," he said without looking up. "This is not a copy of the agreement that was filed with the land office. These are two different documents." "Yes," she said. "The filed document transfers full title with no buyback provision. This document..." He tapped Rebecca Farrow's copy. "This document is a lease with a purchase option. Same parties, same property, different terms, different outcome. Filed after the original agreement was signed," she said, "using Miller's signature from the lease document." Aldrich looked up. "They transposed his signature," she said. "Thomas's firm did the same thing twice in Baltimore. You take the genuine signature from one document, you have a skilled penman reproduce it on a different document with different terms, and then you file the second document as if it were what was agreed upon." She paused. "The original agreement disappears. The filed version becomes the legal record. The person who signed has no way to prove what they actually agreed to unless they kept a copy." "Which Rebecca Farrow's father did," Aldrich said. "Which Rebecca Farrow's father did," she said. Aldrich sat back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Carter," he said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "The knowledge you have of this process, the specifics of how the signature transfer works, the pattern of the filing alteration. This isn't something most people would know." "No," she said. "Where did you learn it?" She met his eyes. "I spent 5 years watching my husband's business partners practice it," she said. "And then I spent 5 more years understanding what I had watched." A pause. "When you live inside something, you learn how it works, whether you want to or not." Aldrich looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded with a slowness that meant he had decided something. "I'm going to file the federal complaint today," he said. "This afternoon. I'll include the Farrow documents, the Pearson testimony summary, and your corroborating records from Baltimore." He picked up his pen. "When Holloway finds out, and he will find out probably within the week, he's going to move fast. He may try to pressure the witnesses. He may try to accelerate the extradition request. I know. The federal filing creates a hold, but it doesn't make you untouchable. If he can find a way to remove you from the territory, before the hold is formally recorded." "He won't," she said. Aldrich looked up. "I won't let him," she said. He studied her. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I have been removed before. I have been pressured and threatened and physically hurt, and legally maneuvered and socially destroyed, and every time it happened I survived it by being careful and quiet and invisible." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not doing that anymore. If Holloway comes for me, I will be standing exactly where he can find me, with exactly the people who can witness what he does, and I will let him show everyone in Silver Creek and the territorial court exactly what kind of man he is." Aldrich was very still. "That's a dangerous approach," he said. "It's the only one that ends this," she said. "For me, for Rebecca Farrow, for Edwin Pearson's widow, for every person on the other side of a Holloway transaction who signed something they didn't understand because they were alone and frightened and out of options." She held his gaze. "I'm not the only one. I'm just the one who knows enough to do something about it." Aldrich picked up his pen. He began to write.
"Job try."
She was halfway back to Silver Creek when the rider caught up with her. She heard the hoofbeats behind her, and her hand went to the scabbard before she thought about it, and she turned in the saddle and saw one of Holloway's men, Cole, the same man who had come to the ranch riding hard from the direction of town. He pulled up beside her. She kept her hand near the rifle. "Mr. Holloway would like to speak with you," Cole said. He was trying to be genial and not quite managing it. "Mr. Holloway can come to the ranch," she said. "He'd prefer somewhere more—" "I'm sure he would," she said. "Tell him the ranch, this afternoon. If he has something to say, he can say it in front of Caleb Whitaker." Cole looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected this response. "He's not someone to antagonize Miss Carter." "Mrs. Marsh," she said deliberately this time, "and I know exactly what he is." She nudged the horse forward. Cole didn't follow. She rode back to Silver Creek with her spine straight and both hands steady and her heart going faster than she would have liked, because she was afraid she had told Aldrich the truth about that she was still afraid, but the anger was still bigger than the fear. And she had learned in the last several weeks that when you put those two things together in the right proportion, you could walk toward something rather than away from it. She arrived at the ranch an hour before Holloway did. She told Caleb everything. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "You invited him here?" "Yes." "To our house?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "You're not going to argue with me." "Would it help?" "No." "Then no," he said. "I'm not going to argue with you." She almost smiled. Almost. They were waiting on the porch when Holloway rode up at 4:15, and he came alone, which told her more than he intended it to. A man who comes alone to a confrontation either has nothing to threaten with, or has already decided that threats won't work and is trying something else. He dismounted and looked at them both standing side by side on the porch steps, and she watched him recalibrate. Whatever he had been expecting, it wasn't this. He had expected probably to find her frightened, to find Caleb uncertain, to find a gap between them that he could use. Instead, he found them shoulder to shoulder, and the gap he was looking for wasn't there. "Evening," Holloway said. He was still smooth, still that practiced warmth on the surface, but the edges were showing now the way edges show on men who have just realized that the situation is not going the way they planned. "Mr. Holloway," Evelyn said, "say what you came to say." He looked at her for a moment. "I came to offer you an arrangement," he said. "Simple and fair. You leave Silver Creek voluntarily. I withdraw the civil complaint against Caleb's land. Franklin Marsh's extradition request goes quiet. Everyone walks away with what they need." The audacity of it was almost impressive. "And the Pearsons," she said. He blinked. "And Rebecca Farrow," she said. Something shifted in his face. "And the other families whose land you've taken through documents that don't say what you told them they said," she said. "What do they walk away with, Mr. Holloway?" The warmth on his face was gone now. What was underneath it was colder and more honest. "You're making a mistake," he said. You made yours the night you had someone deliver that note to the post office, she said. On your own paper, in a handwriting I've now had compared by a document examiner to your personal correspondence on file at the territorial court. She watched his face. You made yours when you assumed that a woman who had survived what I survived wouldn't know how to fight back. Holloway looked at her. Then he looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. He didn't need to. Holloway got back on his horse. He didn't threaten. He didn't shout. Men like him didn't shout when they knew the situation had turned. They went quiet, and they recalculated, and they looked for the next angle. But there was something in his eyes as he rode away that she recognized and did not underestimate. This was not over. He would find another way. He would look for the thing she hadn't covered, the angle she hadn't anticipated, the person she hadn't protected. She stood on the porch and watched him ride away and kept her face still and her breathing even, and she thought, I know, and I'll be ready. Caleb stood beside her. He'll be back, he said. I know, she said. We should get inside. He paused. It's cold. She turned and looked at him. This quiet man who had put a lock on her door before she arrived, who had asked if she was hungry on the first day, who had said you survived when she confessed everything and meant it the way that words rarely mean things when people say them. Thank you, she said. He looked slightly puzzled. For what? She thought about it. For all of it, she might have said. For the lock and the blanket and the tea. For all right when she needed someone to say all right. For standing beside her on this porch like it was the most natural thing in the world. For being the kind of man she had stopped believing existed somewhere in the years when she had the most reason to believe in that kind of man. For standing here, she said. He held her gaze. There's nowhere else I'd be, he said, and that was the most honest thing either of them had said to each other, and it settled between them in the cold evening air like something that had always been there waiting to be said out loud. They went inside. The fight wasn't finished. But for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach with 3 broken ribs and a secret she was terrified would destroy her second chance, Evelyn Carter believed they were going to win it. Holloway's next move came 3 days later, and it came from a direction she hadn't fully covered. He went after the witnesses. She found out from Rebecca Farrow herself, who rode to the ranch on a gray morning with her jaw set and her hands shaking slightly. Not from cold. Evelyn could tell the difference, and who sat down at the kitchen table and said without preamble that 2 men had come to her house the previous evening. What did they say? Evelyn asked. That my copies of my father's documents were fraudulent. Rebecca Farrow was 31, a rancher's wife with capable hands and tired eyes, and the particular posture of someone who has spent a long time holding herself together through difficulty. They said if I submitted them to any court or land office, I'd be charged with forgery. They said my father had signed the real documents willingly, and that what I had in my box was something my father had made up after the fact, because he regretted the sale. They said your father forged his own documents. Yes? Evelyn sat across from her and looked at her steadily. Did they threaten you directly? Your safety, your family? They didn't have to, Rebecca said. They mentioned my husband's supply contract with the Territorial Trading Post. Said it would be a shame if that arrangement fell through. She looked at her hands. We need that contract. Without it, we lose the winter income that carries us to spring. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. She was thinking. She was thinking about Holloway's timing 3 days after their confrontation on the porch, which meant he had moved immediately, which meant he was afraid, which meant that underneath the smooth surface and the practiced warmth, he had understood exactly what she and Aldrich had built, and he was trying to dismantle it piece by piece before the federal filing could lock everything in place. She was also thinking about the supply contract, and about who controlled the Territorial Trading Post. Who holds the Trading Post contract? She said. Rebecca looked up. Harrison Briggs. She stopped. His store loans are through Holloway's bank. Of course they were. All right, Evelyn said. Rebecca listened to me carefully. Aldrich filed the federal complaint 2 days ago. The hold is already in place. Holloway cannot touch the land case or the territorial records while the federal inquiry is active. What he's doing right now. She leaned forward slightly. He's trying to frighten you into withdrawing before you understand that you're already protected. Rebecca looked at her. Am I protected? Your testimony and your documents are part of a federal filing, Evelyn said. Threatening a federal witness is a crime, not a territorial matter of federal crime. She held her gaze. If those men come back, I need you to write down every word they say, every name they mention, every threat they make. A pause. Because everything they do right now is evidence. Rebecca was quiet. I'm frightened, she said. I know, Evelyn said. So am I. She said it without apology because she had learned that honesty about fear did not weaken the people you were trying to strengthen. It told them they weren't alone in it. But I'm more angry than frightened, Evelyn said. And what they did to your father, what they're trying to do to you right now, that's exactly why. Rebecca Farrow sat at that kitchen table for a long time. Then she said, Tell me what to do. Caleb had been listening from the doorway. When Rebecca left, he came into the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Evelyn and sat down. He's going after all of them, Caleb said. Not just Rebecca, Pearson's widow too, probably. Yes. We need to move faster than Aldrich planned. I know. She wrapped her hands around the cup. I'm going back to Aldrich today. The federal commissioner needs to understand that Holloway is actively intimidating witnesses. That accelerates the timeline. It changes the nature of the complaint from a property matter to obstruction. Caleb nodded. He was already standing up. I'll ride with you, he said. You need to check on Mrs. Pearson first, she said. Take the South Road through town. Let people see you. Let Holloway's people see you moving normally. She looked up at him. Don't let him know we're scared. He looked at her. Are we scared? He said. Yes, she said. But he doesn't get to know that. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. All right, he said. They rode out within 20 minutes in opposite directions, and the morning felt like the moment before a storm, when the air goes very still and everything holds its breath. Chemb. Aldrich was already at his desk when she arrived, and the look on his face when she walked through the door told her he had already heard something. Sit down, he said. She sat. I received a communication this morning from the Territorial Governor's office, he said. The extradition request from Franklin Marsh has been formally acknowledged and assigned to a processing clerk. He paused. Normally, that process takes 6 to 8 weeks. Normally, she said. Someone has requested expedited handling. He looked at her over his spectacles. The request was accompanied by a letter of support from a Judge Henry Harding of Silver Creek. The room was very quiet. Harding, Holloway's bank, Holloway's judge, the man who held debt from the man who wanted her gone, and he had just inserted himself into a federal process using his territorial judicial standing to accelerate a proceeding that, if it moved fast enough, could remove her from the territory before the federal land inquiry concluded. If she was gone extradited, removed, taken back to Baltimore to face Franklin Marsh's constructed case, then the federal filing lost its primary witness. Aldrich could continue, but without her testimony connecting the Baltimore pattern to Holloway's operations. The link between the two conspiracies was circumstantial. Provable, maybe, but harder. Much harder. She understood now. This was Holloway's real move. Not the land challenge. Not the rumors. Not the intimidation of Rebecca Farrow. This. Remove the witness. Remove the connection. Let the case become a property dispute that could be delayed and litigated and slowly strangled over years while he continued operating. She said, "How long do we have?" If expedited processing is approved, the governor's office could issue a removal order in 2 weeks. Then we have less than 2 weeks. Possibly. She looked at him. What do we need? He took off his spectacles and set them on the desk. I need to depose you formally, he said. Today, everything you know, every date, every name, every figure from the Baltimore transactions, and every connection to Holloway's operations here. I need it on record, in a sworn deposition, that exists independently of your physical presence in the territory." She understood immediately. "If I'm removed, but my deposition is already in the federal record, your testimony exists whether you're here or not," he said. "It's not as strong as your presence, but it's not nothing. It's considerably more than nothing." "Then let's start," she said. He reached for paper. She talked for 4 hours. She told him everything. Not just the things she had documented in the notebook, but everything behind them, the context, the pattern, the specific mechanics of how Thomas Marsh's firm had operated, and how that operation had connections that reached, she now believed, into at least 3 Western territories, including Montana. She told him about the letter she had seen on Thomas's desk. She told him about a name she had heard twice in conversations. She wasn't supposed to overhear a name she had never been able to place, until she sat in this office 3 weeks ago, and Aldrich mentioned in passing that Holloway had a business partner in Wyoming who managed his non-banking interests. The name was the same. Aldrich's pen stopped moving. He looked up. "Say that name again," he said. She said it. He was very still for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and produced a file and turned it to face her and pointed to a name on the 3rd page. The same name. She stared at it. "That's the registered agent for 4 of Holloway's Wyoming property transfers," Aldrich said. "Filed 2 years ago." He looked at her. "And you're telling me that name appears in connection with Thomas Marsh's Baltimore operations?" "I heard it twice," she said. "Both times in conversations about Western investment accounts. Specific accounts. I didn't understand the context then." "You understand it now," Aldrich said. "It's not 2 separate schemes," she said. "It's one scheme in 2 locations with a connecting infrastructure." Aldrich sat back. "This is larger than I understood," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "This isn't a territorial matter," he said. "This is federal fraud across multiple states and territories." "Yes." He looked at her for a long time. "Miss Carter," he said, "do you understand what you've just handed me?" "I understand what I have handed both of us," she said. "And I understand that the faster we move, the less time they have to bury it." He stood up. He crossed the room to a cabinet and opened it and began pulling files, and his movements had a quality she hadn't seen in him before, urgency contained, but real. "I need to contact the federal district office directly," he said. "Not through the territorial chain, directly, and I need you to sign the deposition before you leave this office." "Bring the paper," she said. She signed, and somewhere in that moment, pen on paper, her name written clearly and deliberately in a formal legal document. Something in her shifted. Not the anger. The anger was still there, useful and cold and precise. But underneath it something settled. The feeling of someone who has been running for a very long time and has just finally decided to stop running and turn around and face the thing that's been chasing them. She was done running. She had said that to herself before, but now it was different. Now it was on paper. Now it was real in the way that things only become real when you have committed to them completely and can't take it back. She walked out of Aldrich's office into the cold Montana afternoon and stood on the street for a moment and let herself feel it, all of it. The fear and the anger and the exhaustion, and underneath those things so deep, she almost missed it. Something that might have been hope. She had not felt hope in a very long time. She rode back to Silver Creek. Caleb was waiting on the porch. She could see from 50 yards out that something had happened. She knew his stillness well enough by now to read its variations. This was not his ordinary quiet. This was the stillness of a man who had received information and was holding it steady until he could pass it to someone who needed to know. She tied the horse and came up the steps. "Mrs. Pearson," he said. She stopped. "Is she all right?" "She's fine," he said quickly. "She's in the house. She came here 2 hours ago." He paused. "She wasn't alone." Evelyn looked at him. "She brought 3 other women," he said. "Wives of men who sold to Holloway in the last 4 years. She said—" He stopped. He seemed to be choosing words carefully. "She said she'd been waiting 4 years for someone to start this fight. She didn't want to wait anymore. Evelyn stared at him. She walked into the house. The kitchen was full. 4 women, ranging from about 40 to over 70, sitting around the table and standing by the wall, and they all looked at her when she came in with expressions she recognized because she had worn that expression herself. The expression of people who have been frightened for too long and have finally found a room where they are allowed to be angry instead. Mrs. Pearson spoke first. "You're the one who's fighting him," she said. It wasn't a question. "We're fighting him," Evelyn said. Something moved through the room, a collective shift barely visible but real. "Tell us what you need," one of the other women said. Evelyn sat down at the table. She told them. She told them about the deposition and the federal filing and what Aldrich needed. She told them about the expedited extradition request and what it meant and how much time they had. She told them what testimony would look like and what they would need to say and how to say it so that it was useful rather than just painful. She told them the truth, which was that it would not be easy and might not be fast, and Holloway would fight every step of it. And then she told them the other truth, which was that 4 years of this man operating in Silver Creek had produced a room full of women who had all been waiting separately alone in their own private anger for exactly this moment. "You're not alone in this anymore," she said. "None of you are." Mrs. Pearson looked at her across the table. "Neither are you," she said. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of December, not Harding's territorial court. Federal. Aldrich had moved with a speed and ferocity that she hadn't fully anticipated, and the federal district judge, a man named Carver, brought in from the district seat 300 miles away, had looked at the initial filing and issued a summons for Holloway, suspended the extradition processing, and requested the Territorial Land Office surrender its original survey records for independent examination. Harding had objected. Carver had overruled him in a single sentence. Silver Creek spent the days before the hearing in a particular state of suspended tension. She could feel it when she went to town, the way people watched her, not with hostility now, but with something she couldn't immediately categorize. She thought about it on the ride home, and decided it was attention. Real attention, not the gossipy kind. The kind that meant people were paying attention because what was happening mattered to them personally. Because it did. Because Holloway's bank held loans across half the county, and half the county had in the last 2 weeks begun to wonder whether the terms they had signed were the terms they had agreed to. 2 more families came forward, then 3 more. Aldrich worked 18 hours a day, and she worked beside him for most of them. And Caleb kept the ranch running and brought her food when she forgot to eat and drove her back from the county seat when it was too late to ride safely. And the days went fast in the way that days go fast when you are inside something that matters. 4 days before the hearing, Franklin Marsh arrived in Silver Creek. She found out from Caleb, who found out from the stable boy who had taken his horse, who mentioned it to the blacksmith, who mentioned it to the man at the feed store, who mentioned it to the man who delivered firewood to the ranch on Thursday afternoons. Small towns. She had hated that about them when she arrived. She was grateful for it now. "He's here," she told Aldrich that afternoon. Aldrich looked up. Franklin Marsh personally. "Yes." "That tells us something. It tells us he's frightened," she said. "A man who sends letters and lawyers doesn't get on a train and travel 2,000 miles unless something has gone wrong with the version he was controlling from a distance." "What went wrong," Aldrich said slowly, "is that you are still here." "Yes." "He expected you to run." "He's never known me not to run," she said. "Every time before I ran, I got smaller, I got quieter. I found a way to make myself easier to manage." She looked at him. "He doesn't know what to do with me standing still." Aldrich had the expression of a man who was revising his understanding of a situation. "Don't meet with him alone," he said. "I have no intention of it. Don't meet with him at all without Caleb present." "I know." "And if he attempts to—" "I know," she said again more quietly. "I know what he's capable of. I know exactly what he's capable of." She paused. "That's why I'm not afraid of him the way I used to be. I know every move he has. I've watched him use all of them." She was wrong about one thing. Franklin Marsh had one move she hadn't anticipated. He came to the ranch the morning before the hearing. She heard the horse and looked out and saw him crossing the yard alone, and something cold moved through her. Not fear exactly, but the body's memory of fear. The physical reflex that years of a certain kind of danger builds into your muscles without asking permission. She stood up from the kitchen table. Caleb was already at the door. "I've got it," she said. He looked at her. "I've got it," she said again. "Stand here. Let me open the door." He stepped back. She opened the door. Franklin Marsh was 60 years old and looked like his brother. The way a hard winter looks like an ordinary winter, the same basic structure, more damage accumulated. He was well dressed in Eastern clothes that looked wrong against the Montana cold, and his face had the composed blankness of a man who has practiced his expressions for decades. "Evelyn," he said. "Mr. Marsh," she said. He looked past her at Caleb and then back to her. "I'd like to speak with you privately." "Whatever you want to say, you can say in front of my fiancé," she said. Something moved through his face, an adjustment. "I came to offer you a resolution," he said. "A final one. Private clean, no court involvement." He paused. "I will withdraw the extradition request. All claims against you from the Marsh estate will be dropped. In exchange, you withdraw from the federal filing. Whatever documentation you've provided to the court attorney, you recant it. Say it was mistaken. Say you misremembered." He looked at her. "You walk away clean. You have your life here. Everyone goes home." Evelyn looked at him. She looked at this man who had come to her house after her husband's funeral and told her she would not keep what she'd built. Who had sent men to remove her from her own home? Who had she now understood arranged for the circumstances that had sent her running into the arms of a scheme that was connected to his own family's interests, whether by design or by the particular cruelty of coincidence? She looked at him for a long time. "No," she said. His composure shifted, just slightly. "Evelyn, you need to think carefully." "I have thought carefully," she said. "For months. While I was running, and while I was hiding, and while I was lying in a bed 3,000 miles from Baltimore, trying to heal 3 broken ribs that your men gave me." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "I've thought about nothing else, and my answer is no." "You understand what I can still do. You came here alone," she said. "You traveled 2,000 miles alone, and you came to this door alone, and you're offering me a deal instead of a threat, which means Aldrich's filing has already done enough damage that you can't afford to make threats anymore." She held his gaze. "The federal commissioner has the documents, Mr. Marsh. He has the depositions. He has the names, including the name that connects your family's investments to Richard Holloway's Montana operations." She paused. "You didn't come here to threaten me. You came here because you're trying to contain this before it becomes something you can't contain." Franklin Marsh looked at her. For the first time in her life, she watched him have nothing to say. "It's already something you can't contain," she said. "Go home." He left. She closed the door. She stood with her hand flat against the wood for a moment, feeling her heart going fast in her chest. And then Caleb was behind her, not touching her, just there close, that specific warmth. And she turned around, and he was looking at her, with that unguarded expression, the one he didn't always manage to keep below the surface. "You all right?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." The hearing lasted 2 days. She testified for 4 hours on the first day, and it was the most frightening and the most clarifying thing she had done in her life, sitting in a federal proceeding and saying out loud in complete sentences everything she knew and everything she had witnessed and everything she had survived, with Franklin Marsh sitting 20 feet away and Richard Holloway beside him, and Judge Carver looking at her from the bench with the specific attention of a man who understands that what he is hearing is important. She did not look away from Carver when she spoke. She did not look at Marsh or Holloway. She looked at Carver, and she told the truth, and she told it completely, and she held herself together for 4 hours through sheer force of the same will that had carried her off a stagecoach with broken ribs and into a stranger's life, and through everything that came after. Caleb sat in the gallery. She could feel exactly where he was without looking. Mrs. Pearson testified. Rebecca Farrow testified. 2 of the other women testified. Aldrich presented the documents and the survey records and the forensic comparison that showed 2 different versions of the same filing in the Territorial Land Office. One original one altered the alterations made in a hand that the document examiner identified as consistent with the signature of Holloway's land agent. On the second day, Holloway's attorney cross-examined her for 90 minutes and found nothing she hadn't anticipated and nothing she couldn't answer because she had lived inside this knowledge for years, and it was not something she could be confused about or worn down on. When the cross-examination ended, Caleb caught her eye from the gallery. He gave her a single small nod. She looked back at Judge Carver. Carver issued his preliminary findings that afternoon. The land challenge against Caleb's eastern boundary was dismissed. The survey records showed no discrepancy in the original 1877 filing. The challenge had been based on an altered copy, and the alteration was now a matter of federal record. The extradition request was formally suspended pending investigation of Franklin Marsh's role in the broader fraud scheme. Richard Holloway's bank accounts were frozen pending a full audit of territorial loan records. And the connecting name, the man in Wyoming Carver, referred that portion to the federal prosecutor's office in Denver. It was not over. These things were never over in a single afternoon. There would be more filings and more proceedings and more months of Aldrich working through documentation and more moments when the machinery of it felt slow and inadequate against the size of what had been done. But Holloway was not untouchable anymore, and Franklin Marsh caught his train back to Baltimore that evening, and she watched the stage pull away from the Silver Creek Depot, and she felt the weight that had been sitting on her chest since the night she had packed one bag and walked out of that house in Baltimore. She felt it shift. Not disappear. She was not naive enough to believe it simply disappeared. But it moved to a different place. A place she could manage. A place that was part of her history rather than the thing that defined her present. Caleb stood beside her on the depot platform. "It's not finished," she said. "No," he said. "It'll take months. Maybe longer." "Probably." She was quiet for a moment. "I can handle months," she said. He looked at her sideways, and there was something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that lived just before one, the warmth before the expression, the feeling before the word. "I know you can," he said. They walked back through Silver Creek together, through the town that had whispered about her and doubted her, and slowly over the course of weeks begun to understand what it had in her. And the people they passed acknowledged them. Some with nods, some with greetings. Mrs. Pearson with a hand briefly pressed to Evelyn's arm as she passed, a gesture so small and so complete that it took Evelyn a moment to recover from it. They were almost to the wagon when Martha Hale came out of the dry goods store. Evelyn braced herself automatically. Martha looked at her for a moment. "I heard what you did," Martha said. "For the Pearsons, and for Rebecca Farrow." She paused. "I owe you an apology." Evelyn looked at her. "You don't have to." "I do?" Martha said with the directness of someone who has decided something and is seeing it through regardless of how uncomfortable it is. "I had a role in what Holloway was doing even if I didn't know it. I repeated things I shouldn't have repeated about you. I'd like to—" She stopped. "I'd like to do better." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "All right," she said. Martha nodded. She went back into her store. Evelyn stood on the street for a moment. "You all right?" Caleb asked. "That keeps happening," she said. "What does people being more than I expected them to be?" He considered this. "Good problem to have," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." Dad, They married on a Saturday in January, in the small church at the edge of Silver Creek, with Mrs. Pearson and Rebecca Farrow and Aldrich and a dozen people from town filling the pews, and the ceremony was short and honest. And the minister said the words, and they said the words back. And when it was done, she stood beside Caleb Whitaker in the cold January light and felt the particular solidity of something that had been built from real materials, not from desperation or transaction or the need to survive, but from 6 months of choosing each other day by day in the specific and ordinary and extraordinary details of a shared life. That evening, standing on the porch of the ranch that was now hers as completely as it was his, she looked out over the land, the creek land that was still theirs, the hills to the north, the first stars coming out over Montana, and Caleb came to stand beside her with 2 cups of coffee. And he handed her one, and they stood together in the cold and the quiet. "Do you ever regret it?" she said. "Any of it?" He thought about it the way he thought about everything fully without rushing. "No," he said. "Even the hard parts." "Especially the hard parts," he said. "The hard parts are why we're here." She looked at him. He was looking at the land, and his face in profile was that careful, steady face she had been learning to read since the first day, and she knew it now well enough to know what was underneath it. And what was underneath it was simple and real and entirely without performance. "I spent years after my wife died believing the good parts of my life were behind me," he said. "That I'd had my chance and I'd lost it, and the rest of it was just work, just getting through." He paused. "Then you stepped off that stagecoach, and you were carrying more than I understood, and you were braver than you knew, and you were the most honest person I'd ever watched try to be dishonest." She almost laughed. "I was trying very hard to seem fine," she said. "I know," he said. "You were terrible at it." She did laugh, then a real laugh, the kind she hadn't had access to for years, and it moved through her chest without the shadow of pain she had carried for so long, and it came out into the cold Montana evening and disappeared into the dark and the stars. "I'm glad you couldn't see through me," she said. "I could always see through you," he said. "I just didn't need you to know that yet." She shook her head. She looked back out at the land. 3 broken ribs and a 2,000-mile journey, and a stranger's advertisement in a matrimonial gazette and a lock on a bedroom door. A question asked in a root cellar. 2 words that had broken through a wall that years of pain had built. How long? How long have you been carrying that alone? She had carried it for years, and she had put it down. Not all at once, but in pieces, one truth at a time, in a kitchen and a doctor's office and a law office and a federal hearing room and on a porch in the cold. And what she had found on the other side of putting it down was not emptiness, the way she had feared, not the terrifying vacancy of a life without its armor, but this particular warmth, this specific man beside her, this land and this life and this ordinary, extraordinary evening. She had come west to survive. She had stayed to live. And standing in the January cold with a cup of coffee going warm in her hands and Caleb Whitaker's shoulder solid against hers, Evelyn Carter. Evelyn Whitaker now, and she would carry that name like something chosen rather than something inherited. Understood that the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with 3 broken ribs and the careful, practiced face of someone who had learned not to need anything had not disappeared. She was still there. She always would be. But she was no longer alone, and she never would be again.